Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Georgia Tolfo, collections researcher at the National Archives, and I'd like to welcome you all to the second session of Working with Difficult Records, a new series of conversation organized by the collections research and archive sector leadership teams at the National Archives. Today's session will reflect on the emotional pressure and responsibilities of providing access to records of traumatic histories, on the problems of closed, redacting, or missing records, and on the feelings that need to be navigated while doing so. To do so, to open this conversation, I'm joined by four speakers actually today from the archive sector that have worked with survivors or relatives of victims of violent and or traumatic events. Our speakers today are Eliza McKee from the National Archives, Harry Jonkers from the Holocaust Centre North, and Gillian Boll and Malcolm Mathieson from Amnesty International. And I will introduce them a bit more properly when they start presenting. Before doing that, though, as always, I have to do a little bit of housekeeping. And just to inform you that the session will be in 1 hour long. The presentations themselves will be around 15 minutes each, and then we will have a Q&A at the end. During the Q&A, I will facilitate a conversation with the speakers, and I will try to address the questions that you can submit in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Colleagues will shortly share information on how to do so. Following the feedback we received last time after the first session and on reflection, we have decided to enable the chat for you to share thoughts and reflections as well as resources or links if you wish. Given the sensitivity and the sensitive nature of the topic covered today, just please be mindful of different lived experiences and share with your peers as part of our community. If you wish to contribute anonymously, you can change your name by hovering over your name as listed in participants and clicking the three dots there. Your contributions will support our efforts to encourage and support collaboration across the sectors. Finally, just a note that the presentation will be shared online on the National Archives YouTube channel without the Q&A section. So please, if you want to attend that in future, join the event online. We can't guarantee that all presentations can always be recorded and made available, so it's always best to attend if possible. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speakers, Dr. Eliza McKee. She's a specialist in Northern Ireland records at the National Archives and a former US-UK Fulbright scholar. Her research focuses on 19th and 20th century Irish social and cultural history. And at the National Archives, she leads on a landmark digitisation initiatives on trouble-related records, prioritizing accessibility, ethical stewardship, and trauma-informed practices. So over to you, Eliza.
Thank you, Georgia, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to dive straight in. So for those working in an archive, confronting and reflecting on what trauma is and how it might manifest in and through our collections is almost inevitable. Trauma hides in plain sight in the content of the records we handle, through their silences and gaps, and in the language used. We can witness the long-lasting effects of trauma in the responses of researchers and visitors to the material they access. We can experience it vicariously working with communities which have historically been marginalized and oppressed. We can also experience traumatic exposures to records as we engage in our work. And there are various factors that influence emotional responses to traumatic exposures, such as the nature of the exposure, personal history, and connections to the traumatic material, as well as expectations and organizational context. And today I'm going to explore a bit of my work as Principal Record Specialist for Northern Ireland Records at TNA. I firstly worked here on something called the Victims Payment Board, which I'll explain in a second. And then I returned to manage a large-scale digitisation project still relating to Troubles material. So my work is therefore centred around being a specialist in the history of modern Ireland and Northern Ireland, in particular in research and outputs that relate to a conflict of which, from a place that I'm from as well. So I've been working in great detail with records detailing human suffering, atrocities and injustices. A lot of the information I've interacted with relates to the community I'm from, whose lives intersect with these records. And while my accent is soft, as I've lived abroad, I'm actually from there. My family still live there. And I moved to London to take up my job here at TNA, and only left Northern Ireland at that point. So there's a very personal connection to the material that I'm researching and working on. Working with archival materials that document political violence, sectarian conflict, and human suffering, such as police file, inquest documents, medical reports, or case files, creates a unique psychological landscape. Record workers in this context operate in a space between memory work, public service, and trauma exposure, even when they themselves have no direct lived experience of the specific events, or sometimes when they do. So I wear two hats. I'm a historian, but also a qualified archivist. And I've often been concerned with assessing documents for evidential qualities that I rarely stop to assess psychological consequences of viewing large quantities of distressing material until on occasion it's caught up with me. Exposures to these can be significant on the researcher or archivist. And in this paper, I'm going to reflect on a bit of that exposure that I've navigated in the roles that I've had here at the National Archives on a couple of these projects, outlining some of the approaches that I personally take to my work here to support sort of this traumatic interaction with the archives. Move my slide along. Okay, so this the two roles that I've had here at TNA, but I'm going to just give you a little brief overview of the Troubles for those that don't know too much about it. It's described as an ethno-sectarian conflict, and it, generally speaking, we can say that it's between 1969 to 1998, but historians debate this greatly. It really didn't end in 1998, and we're still dealing with the legacies. In total, 3,720 people were killed, 47,541 people are known to have been injured, and really impossible to calculate how many people were bereaved or traumatized from this. There were 36,923 shootings, 16,209 bombings. And given that the population during the conflict was about 1.4 million people, the violence, deaths, and injuries were very high for the size of the population. And it's a conflict that in many ways remains unresolved to this day. And part of the work that I've been doing at TNA connects to the very unresolved nature of the conflict and the legacy issues that we continue to deal with a contested past, which is often dubbed a sort of post-conflict society. And we still suffer in Northern Ireland from adverse effects of this period, manifested by mental health distress, gender-based violence, addictions, intergenerational trauma, separatism and segregation in key aspects of daily life. It's a period of violent political conflict that has had an insidious and porous impact on every fabric of civilian life in Northern Ireland. So just very briefly on the sort of type of work I've been doing, and before I move on to more sort of practical things that I do to address the work. So the Victims Payment Board was established in February 2021, and its purpose is about providing those living with permanent disablement, either physical or psychological, caused by injury through no fault of their own, in a Troubles-related incident, with payments and access to historical information, primarily in acknowledgement of the acute harm which they'd suffered. And I processed on my own 200 cases documenting sort of thousands of incidents. And as part of this, I was sent a lot of personal information about applicants, full of sort of GDPR concerns, but also access to what had happened to them physically and psychologically. Quite a lot of acute distress written from the perspective of the individual making the application. So very intimate access to that information. So something I found really challenging in this role was where to put that information in my mind that I had, particularly the medical information. I was looking at a lot of closed material, contacting departments about retained files. So carrying that knowledge of other people's trauma carries a weight of responsibility. And sometimes when processing cases, I'd contend with knowing people actually specifically listed in incidents or knowing of them, because there's one degree of separation in Northern Ireland. It's a small population with strong connections between us. And knowing the impact that some of the incidents described had on communities of which I know or am connected to was also very impactful. So this sort of very deep, intimate knowledge. There was one incident that came through that my father had actually been present at, which had a particular impact on me personally, because I've seen the legacy within my own family of that particular atrocity. So the digitisation project, in my current role, I'm managing a major project to digitise hopefully between 5,000 and 10,000 troubles-related records. They're all open records this time, but there's a sort of a lot less sensitive in the sense of the closed records and less personal information, but still exposed every day to a lot of information that deals with conflict and its aftermath. So the sensitivity now is sort of more broadly thematic and doing justice to covering as much of this content as possible, with this sort of legacy of people not having access to information in Northern Ireland that's held in certain institutions. So there's a sort of different type of interaction to sensitivity now. And I feel a very strong sense of responsibility to deliver through this research, sort of create greater access in Northern Ireland to material. So I'm going to now move to how I deal with this, looking at some of the themes on the slide. So firstly, compassion fatigue. It's often described in clinical fields, but I think it also appears in our work as archivists, historians, information professionals, human rights documentation staff. Why does it arise in my work? Well, reading repeated accounts of violence, loss, disappearances, interrogations, bombings, and procedural failures can create empathetic overload. You can become an emotional proxy when assisting family members seeking access to sensitive records. You may be exposed to unresolved grief, decades-long searches for truth, or the pain of families confronting official files for the first time, especially when they don't contain what they believe to have been their experience. And often the official record doesn't document what people experience themselves. And so how does this appear in practice? Sometimes emotional blunting, exhaustion, sort of emotional capacity feeling used up. Some people experience a reduced ability to empathize, but I feel the other way, actually. So much empathy extended that then maybe I struggle with my own self. Cynicism about bureaucratic or political barriers to access, I feel that very strongly. So it's not really a personal failing, it's a sort of predictable occupational hazard in conflict-related archival work. Next, emotional labour in archives of trauma. So digitisation and access teams do substantial front-facing emotional labour, often without explicit recognition. And what does it look like in my context? Managing your own emotional response when viewing graphic or distressing records, presenting calm professionalism when people are distressed or angry about the content of records, navigating politically charged memory landscapes in Northern Ireland with neutrality and sensitivity, absorbing that emotional intensity from survivors, families, or researchers, balancing empathy with procedural neutrality, which is also complicated in the context of being a civil servant. So troubles records carry very high emotional volatility, and archives often become surrogate spaces for grief, truth-seeking, and collective memory, and this intensifies the emotional labour beyond what your archival job descriptions would typically acknowledge. Vicarious trauma. It's deeper and more cumulative than compassion fatigue. And why is it a risk in troubles-related archiving? Well, the troubles involve not only violence, but intergenerational trauma, community fragmentation, and deeply personal narratives, a little bit of which I've reflected on. It's more common, and when there's a shared cultural, geographic, or historical connection, even if indirect. Shared trauma in Northern Ireland means many records workers grew up surrounded by the conflict's legacy, even if not personally victimised. I'd say signs of that in records professionals are when you sort of experience intrusive thoughts or images from records, a heightened startle response, avoiding certain themes, files, or user interactions, losing trust in institutions, emotional numbness or increased anxiety, or feeling personally implicated in the trauma, which is very common in divided societies. Next, shared trauma and specific Northern Ireland considerations. Sort of a unique place for archivists, researchers, and users often share this very small geographical space, the same public memory of events, even if those are contested memories. There's also a shared understanding of that division, familial or community connections to the conflict, exposure to ongoing and unresolved political tensions, and a sense of personal stake in historical narratives. So you get this shared trauma environment where you can be an insider rather than an external observer to the records, which can deepen empathy, but also increase the risk of psychological strain. So, for example, a staff member might handle records describing atrocities in areas they grew up in, or see images of events like I did with the one I mentioned of my father. So next, I'll reflect a little bit on peer support in archival trauma contexts. And I think this is one of our most effective buffers against what I've described. Healthy peer support structures involve regular reflective debriefs, permission to acknowledge emotional impact without stigma, informal check-ins after difficult cases, team norms that recognize the emotional burden of access decisions, shared strategies for boundary setting with users and with the project outputs, rotations of workload balancing to avoid concentrated trauma exposure. And why does this matter in my work? Well, I'm not only dealing with traumatic records, I'm operating within a contested memory environment. Peer validation is critical when you carry the weight of both procedural responsibility and human pain. And my ongoing issue in my work is that I'm the only person working on the project at the minute. So I say this, but I'm very siloed in the impact that this has. But luckily, I can work with our information rights team and with George's team and sort of have a sort of shared network that we're creating here as I'm working on my project on my own. So you can find ways to share that burden. So some coping strategies. Here are some strategies specifically kind of that I adapt and think about. Firstly, organizational, case rotation or thematic rotation of the material I'm looking at. Trauma-informed access policies that recognize the emotional impact of the records on staff as well as researchers and users. Ensuring reasonable workloads and avoiding trauma hotspots assigned to one person. Individual practices, emotional pacing, like taking micro breaks between looking at records, boundary setting, so I won't read witness statements before I go home, for example, and maintaining creative outlets to counterbalance the content saturation. So I've got some ongoing research of my own that I dip into now and again when I'm finding the content of the records I'm looking at all the time too difficult, and I dip in and out of that. On a lighter note, this is a very personal one to me, dark humor and minimization. And I'm not saying dark humor about the content of the records, but more at a higher level than that about me personally. So one of my favorite and most used strategies to deal with my work, something that often surprises people when they visit Northern Ireland and speak to the people, is the dark humor in the way in which we minimize trauma and the significance of violent events through linguistic minimization. Minimization is a tactic where an individual intentionally downplays a situation or a thing. And the downplaying the significance in an event or an emotion is a common strategy when you're dealing with feelings of guilt and trauma. I mean, the Troubles in and of itself is an anodyne and euphemistic moniker to describe a violent period of political conflict. Humorous function within traumatized societies in general is interesting, where dark jokes are often used to sustain victims of violence by disrupting the complacency of those who witness it from afar, and can be a powerful mode of resisting the status quo. And I find it quite useful in my place of work where I am the only person working on this material. So it's a coping mechanism for many simply to get through the day. Jokes live on with nuances that hint at the complexity of identity and to grapple with experiences in Northern Ireland more widely. Laughter is a cloak that surrounds you. The best laugh in the world is laughing at the things that are unhappy. And there's probably a certain level of that where I'm from, a laughing at the things that are bad. And I'm happy to read myself here and admit to using humor and minimization as a coping strategy for myself in my role. And there's sort of this general culture to do that where I'm from, to deal with issues that evoke uncomfortable emotion. In the show Dairy Girls, which I've included a sort of image from, set in Dairies in the 90s during the later years of the conflict, perfectly highlights the use of humor to deal with difficult histories and events. It shows four teenage friends navigating their years at school in a segregated city, navigating normal things that teenagers experience against the intense backdrop of conflict. And the attitude is summarized by a quote from the first episode. I'm going to swear briefly. When one of the characters says, "How long does it take to defuse a feckin' bomb anyway? Sure, the wee robots do all the work." And what's really going on is, there's a bomb being diffused, but the girls are able to kind of navigate, as teenagers do, a situation like that, minimizing the intensity of what's actually going on behind them. And I think in Northern Ireland, the population really recognizes this, and the psychologist will tell us it's probably deeply unhealthy, but it is something that I personally lean on quite effectively. And finally, cognitive coping, reframing the work as contributing to human rights, truth recovery, and dignity, recognizing that experiencing emotional impact is a sign of compassion, not insufficiency, identifying personal triggers and planning for them. My final slide, I think it's really important to have a why. Despite the emotional toll, I think that I'm contributing a lot to truth recovery, historical accountability, human dignity for families who've waited decades for information, preservation of evidence for investigations in future generations. Emotional response is a sign of the humanity that you bring to the work. It's not a failure. And I've developed a sort of trauma-informed framework for working with troubles-related records and a document on peer support structures for archivists in working with traumatic content, which I can share during the Q&A if it's useful, and if people want to get in touch about that, I'd be happy to share. It's very much written from my perspective, from my work, but it might be useful to you. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Eliza. That was a really generous and thought-provoking presentation, which I hope the rest of the audience has appreciated. So and now over to the next speaker, Harry Jonkers. She's archivist and member of the. She's an archivist and a member of the senior leadership team of the Holocaust Centre North, and she will present about her work today.
Hello, everyone. It's a delight to be here. And Eliza, that was great. And this sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but now what I want to start with is so many things that you said resonated with me in terms of my own reflections and experience, and coping strategies like dark humor. Yes. And it's nice to hear someone else say that having an emotional response to this work isn't a failure. It's healthy in some respects. Like, we're not robots, and yet I do often get upset at work, actually, and sometimes that can feel unprofessional, but it can be okay. So let me share my slides. 1 second. So I could talk at length about this, but I think actually we're already a little bit behind time, so I'm just going to focus in on a few snapshots. So I've got some slides here to tell you a little bit about our work. So we are Holocaust Centre North, an independent charity at the University of Huddersfield, but I'll give you a bit of context on how we started, what we do, and what's in the collections, what are the difficult things, although the clue is in the title. It's about the Holocaust. And I really wanted to focus in terms of challenges on two of our core user groups, who are our collection donors, so survivor families, but also creative practitioners we work with as part of our artists in residence program called Memorial Gestures. And then I'll also look, like Eliza, at personal coping strategies, but also our more structured organizational support. Bear with me, just doesn't want to go to the next slide. Hang on. I'm just going to manually, bear with me, trying to go forward. There we go. So yes, in a nutshell, we were started by some of these lovely people who were all Holocaust survivors who were persecuted for being Jewish. We started in Leeds in the mid-90s, and we began as the Holocaust Survivors Friendship Association. So the clue again is in the name there, but we've gradually grown since then. And in 2018, the University of Huddersfield very kindly gave us a space. So we now have a permanent exhibition, an archive, a place to teach school children, and do communities work and outreach. When the survivors started us in '95, it was very much against the backdrop of the war and conflict in Bosnia and Rwanda, and this sort of heightened sense that persecution and mass violence was ever present in the world again. And they deliberately started us, and we still are, a non-religious and a non-political organization. We have a mission to educate about the Holocaust. And as I said, we've now got these growing strands of our work. And this is the open call from our Memorial Justice residency, and I included it here. So we started the residency in 2023 because these are the 3 questions that inspired us to begin this work. And the 2 I've highlighted in bold seem particularly relevant to this series, about engaging with a culture of care and trauma-informed practice. And also because Georgia and TNA asked us presenters to consider the challenges for users of working with missing or redacted or closed records. And that final question, the final question on the screen, this really resonated for us at Holocaust Centre North, because we're very aware that the archive is full of absences and silences, gaps, shadows, if you like, of the people who did not survive the Holocaust, and or communities and people that are not represented in many Holocaust archives. So in particular, other groups that were persecuted by the Nazis, like the LGBT community, disabled people, and Roma and Sinti. And increasingly, I've only worked here for 4 years, but increasingly in this sector, in the Holocaust sector, people want to find out about those other experiences, and we get a lot of questions and research inquiries. And I'd say frustration from people when they see that these experiences, stories, and records are not in archives. So quite a bit of my role is explaining the context of why we as an archive have what we do, and in general, Holocaust archives have what they have. But in terms of what we do have, I'm not going to go too much or as much into the collections as I was going to time-wise, but basically at its core, what users are accessing are our personal papers collections. So we have about 150 collections, mainly created and donated by Holocaust survivors and refugees and their descendants who've got a link to the north of England. We also have some other records, for instance, British Army personnel who were prisoners of war or who perhaps liberated concentration camps like Bergen-Belsen. So we have a mixture of records, and as you can imagine, lots of very graphic, sensitive, distressing content. What the other feature of the fact that these are personal papers and they've come from families is that they are in and of themselves very intimate anyway, let alone from the subject matter. We have a lot of people's, family photo albums, their treasured belongings, personal correspondence, love letters, marriage certificates, the whole things that, any one of us might have in our lives. So, as I said, even putting the Holocaust aside, if you are accessing records like this in an archive, that can elicit a very strong emotional response from people. These are just a few examples of the written documents that we have, and perhaps a lot of you or I will immediately be drawn to the red J at the top there. It's a lady called Ellie, her Austrian passport, and this was if you were Jewish in Nazi Germany and Austria, you would have the big red J stamped on your passport. And for users who are accessing our archive, it could be something you could say as small as that, which can elicit a very strong response, perhaps a trigger response. It's very jarring to see these sorts of records, and sometimes, especially the juxtaposition, they might pop up, say, amongst a group of family correspondence, but then you have someone's ID document. And I'm just going to move on from that. This is something a bit nicer, the other side of sort of what we have, lots of family photographs. But in terms of our collections, we also have testimonies that we create in-house. So with survivors, and increasingly their children and grandchildren, and we now do multi-generational testimonies. These are also very challenging and elicit a strong emotional response with users. Because of course, it's when you are watching or listening to someone tell you in person, so to speak, their life story, again, that's very intimate, and it all relates to the Holocaust and intergenerational trauma. So those sorts of records make the impact of these history very clear, I think, and the contemporary relevance of it. And because of the format, they can have more of an impact than, say, if you're reading a written account in black and white on paper. Of course, they all complement each other. Actually, I will skip back one sec. Sorry, on here, we also have some examples of wartime correspondence, for instance, this telegram up here. And then we also have in our collections down here on the right in the green, letters from prison of war or from ghettos and internment camps. And again, the nature of the correspondence itself is challenging, but also it's almost the juxtaposition in the archives, because so often we'll have a sequence of correspondence and letters in the war, and then it stops in 1940 or 41 or 42, whenever it is. And the gap and the silence there is, you know, that someone has been deported or perhaps killed, and that is why there is no more. And then maybe the collections will pick up with post-war correspondence where the families are trying to trace what happened to that person. I should also add, our archives go to the present day, so we do collect whole life records, and so this includes families search for missing relatives after the war, or evidence that they've collected to make compensation claims, and that's where actually we do have lots of copies of perpetrator records, but we don't have originals in our collection in the main. So on to navigating the archive. I think this is where sort of start to have more parallels with what Eliza was saying, but as I said, I'll focus on survivor families. So of course, I feel like I'm going to be very simplistic as well in the interest of time, because clearly there's many layers to unpick here and lots of emotions at play. But yeah, of course, for the survivors who are accessing our records, and that might be the collection donors themselves from the north of England, or members of the public who are coming to us looking for historical context or tracing their family history. The Holocaust is very personal, very raw, living history with ongoing impact, and as we all know, contemporary relevance. And so, of course, even before people, you know, step in the door and read or look at anything, just to engage with this history can be upsetting, destabilizing, bring up all sorts of conflicting and complex emotions, many of which are negative, although I would say not all, but, you know, sadness and anger and numbness, and then where there are gaps and silences, perhaps confusion or frustration. And in particular with children of Holocaust survivors, and I think this isn't exclusive to the Holocaust, but they may not fully acknowledge the impact that their family history is having on them, or engaging with this history because of perceived sense, perhaps of shame or guilt, that their experience pales in comparison to that of their parents. So they may dismiss their own experience of trauma. They might think it's, you know, self-indulgent, or they may be disassociated with it. So we are there as the archivist and the collections team, sort of standing with them whilst this happens. And finally, actually on this point, there's also, of course, for the families, there's grief. There's a long-standing sense of loss, but in many cases, a much more recent grief, because often the point at which a family member comes into contact with us is perhaps because they're near the end of their own life, or they're reflecting on their own life, or very commonly, they are a child of a survivor who has recently passed. Maybe they are clearing their parents' house and they've come across records, which again, they may or may not have known were there, because a lot of survivors didn't talk about their experiences with their children for a long time, if at all. So lots of emotions at play there. And with our creative practitioners, so the artists in residence who stay with us for 9 months, and they do a lot of in-depth research in the archive, and they often intimately get to know one family story in particular, or maybe even meet members of the family if it's appropriate. We see all the sorts of feelings that I mentioned above can come to the play as well, come to the fore. They can be mirrored, and it sort of all ripples out. And many of the applicants for the residencies are in fact have lived experience of trauma within their families, perhaps forced displacement or persecution, and a connection with the Holocaust in some instances. And what we've really noticed in the residency over the last few years is many of them, they really grapple with these feelings, perhaps of inadequacy, and can have sort of paralysis in how to go forward with the research and the work. Or the opposite, or at the same time, they find it really hard to stop researching and to start making the work. Perhaps they have creative blocks, and we have to help them be boundaried and not let the residency and the research into this history take place. And they also, in the challenge of wanting to give us, the audience, a visual and written language to communicate these difficult emotions and the history, they feel a great weight of responsibility, which I think a lot of archivists and people working in this sector also feel, and they're sort of plagued, as we are, by all the potential pitfalls in terms of representation and ethics, and responsibility to the families to do justice to their stories. I can see that I've been speaking for about 13 minutes, so I'm just going to rattle through a little bit. And in terms of the challenges for staff, when I was listening to Anna's first session, Anna Sexton's first session in this series, and also Eliza talking about compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, in every sort of example, I can think of at least one colleague or a user, a creative practitioner, or even volunteers who've experienced one of the symptoms at some point. It's very, very common in the archive sector, as we know, and in particular in the Holocaust. But I thought I would pull out two strands of what I personally find very difficult in this work. And again, a lot of it reflects what Eliza was saying. But the first one is, even though I'm not a therapist, clearly, and I'm very careful to be professional and boundaried with the people that we work with, and be explicit that, we are not therapists, and how I can and cannot support them. Of course, there are huge pastoral responsibilities involved in the work, and it really draws upon your levels of emotional energy and empathy. And actually, I find that's okay. It's like a lot of people, it's finding the time to juggle all this, on a day-to-day basis, because when people come and engage with the archive, you really want to guide them in and lead them out, and you can't just let people engage with this sort of history and then go. That feels very unethical to me. So we always want to make sure that people have time to decompress or check in with us. And secondly, this is adjacent really to the actual Holocaust history and the graphic nature of the records themselves, but it's what I find hard now in 2026 is how this history sits within a contemporary context. So the fact that the authenticity and validity of Holocaust testimonies and the histories is so contested, is so politicized, and doing this work within a context of rising hatred and intolerance globally, particularly against refugees and asylum seekers, is very draining. And a lot of the work that we do at the centre involves managing conflicting opinions and people's potent emotions and polarising beliefs expressed on all sorts of topics. So just to finish off, I would say that, my own coping strategies and what we do as an organisation to create a culture of care, I don't think anything on this is groundbreaking, and like most organisations, people, it's all a work in progress. I think the core for us is about being compassionate to yourself and others when you do this sort of work, to give and create time to yourself and to anyone engaging with these histories, and the space to be open and reflective, and remember you have a life away from this subject matter and work, but also respect that people deal with have different coping strategies, like we all do as colleagues. I spend a lot of time with my dog. Some people have very dark sense of humour. Some people love watching RuPaul's Drag Race after work, and whatever works for you, I think you need to go with that. So thank you.
Thank you, Harry. That was, like Eliza, extremely generous and thought-provoking. And I'm sorry, I just cut very briefly.
It's okay. I rattled through at the end. Everyone always overruns, don't they?
No, if the audience is okay, we might extend this for 10 minutes in order to give ourselves a bit time for Q&A. So our third group of speakers are Malcolm Mathieson and Gillian Boll. They are archivists at Amnesty International, International Secretariat, and they will talk about their work. So over to you, Malcolm and Gillian. Thank you.
Great. Oh, thank you so much to the other speakers. Thanks to you, Georgia, and everyone at TNA for inviting us along to speak today. So my name's Malcolm. I'm full-time archivist at the Amnesty International International Secretariat. I'm here today with Gillian, and obviously this is such a huge topic, and there are many different directions we could have taken our presentation in. We're just very grateful for the opportunity to share our experiences with you all. Next slide, please, James. We thought it'd be useful, first off, to provide some very brief background on Amnesty. So, Amnesty was founded in 1961 by British lawyer Peter Benenson in defence of prisoners of conscience. These are individuals who were imprisoned by their governments for peacefully expressing their political, religious, or conscientiously held beliefs. The Amnesty movement expanded rapidly during the 1960s, and central to this was the compiling of detailed records relating to the abuses being endured by specific individuals. Next slide, please. So if we fast forward to 2026, Amnesty's campaigned on the behalf of millions of individuals around the world, and the mandate of the organisation has also expanded hugely beyond prisoners of conscience. So on screen, you can see just a few of the human rights issues that Amnesty now campaigns on. And as you can see, these are all difficult subjects. Amnesty prides itself on its thorough and accurate research work, and so it follows that the Amnesty archive is full of detailed material relating to all of these subjects and many more. And obviously, all this content is potentially traumatic for the researcher or for the staff member processing the documentation. Next slide, please. So in terms of the question, what kind of content is in the Amnesty archive? So in the context of this presentation, it's the research files that we hold that are the most relevant. So this is the raw material gathered by our researchers in the field that we use to subsequently create our public outputs, such as reports. The archive holds an enormous volume of paper research material relating to human rights violations. It's somewhere in the region of 12,500 archive boxes, and these contain all manner of documentation, including prisoner testimonies, interview transcripts, reports of prison conditions, photographs of violations, and so on. Again, all content that could potentially be highly traumatic. Next slide, please. At this stage, we wanted to quickly touch on our access procedure at the Amnesty Archive. We don't provide public access to our research records. This is sort of precisely because they predominantly record the experiences of named individuals who would have had little to no expectation that any records would be made available publicly. We do, however, answer inquiries, and we have an access procedure in place for those wishing to find out more about their own cases or those of their family members. And Gillian will go on to discuss this a bit further. But our primary users are Amnesty staff members, be they based in London at the International Secretariat or in one of our regional or section offices around the world. So we've just included some images on this slide to illustrate how we feel we need to be mindful of the effects of potentially traumatic content on not just Amnesty Archive staff, but also wider International Secretariat staff and some external researchers as well. And we feel like the top left and the top right images encapsulate the changes we're kind of seeing in the archives as we move from receiving paper to digital content. So the top left image shows a snapshot of our catalogue of our Sri Lanka country files held on paper. So these are clearly ordered, they've got a consistent naming convention. And the top right image is a snapshot of an in-use SharePoint folder, which an Amnesty staff member has labelled graphic. And we're just about to begin harvesting content from SharePoint sites into our digital preservation system. So here we've kind of got two different methods of describing content, one catalogued by the archivist on the left and one by the staff member on the right before it reaches the archive, both potentially containing traumatic material. And it just kind of got me thinking about how potentially traumatic content is signposted in different ways across the organization, and how the proliferation of digital content perhaps inevitably leads to a higher risk of record workers encountering traumatic material, and perhaps whether it's even possible for us as archivists to prepare for appraising files stored within digital folders labeled like this. And then finally, at the bottom, I've included a screenshot taken from the commercial platform Adam Matthew Digital. So this is a subscription-based platform, predominantly used by higher education students, that contains some of Amnesty's digitized published records. So no research files are part of this collection. But still, all Adam Matthew users must read and acknowledge the trigger warning message before any content is displayed to them. And we feel like warnings such as this one are very helpful and should probably be included before any researchers access any material from our archives, as all has the potential to be traumatic. If we go on to the next slide, I'll pass over to Gillian to talk about a couple of case studies.
Hi there, thanks very much. Thanks to Malcolm and to the other speakers. So we thought that we would give a couple of examples of case studies, some case studies that we've had through inquiries. In both of these cases from external inquiries. And so I'll talk about these two cases to tell you about them both, and then reflect on ways in which they're similar and ways in which they're different. So this first one was the case study of the case of Mansour El-Kikia. And this is particularly poignant for me because this was the very first inquiry I ever dealt with when I started with Amnesty in 2019. So it was very striking to me, and as you'll see, it was a very terrible story. So we were contacted by Jihan K. She goes by the name of Jihan K. In 2019, and she was asking us if we had any documentation or basically anything on the case of her father, Mansour El-Kikia. So he was a prominent opposition figure to former Libyan leader Gaddafi, and was effectively put into exile in the early 90s because he was persecuted because of his political affiliation. While he was in Egypt, he was disappeared, as we use the term. He was disappeared from a hotel in 1993, and he was never heard from again. The Libyan authorities repeatedly said that they had absolutely nothing to do with it. And his family were left with no answers for more than 20 years. We were contacted about this case because by Jihan, his daughter, because she was doing research for a documentary that she was making about her father, which has just actually been recently released as My Father and Gaddafi, which you'll see a picture of it there. Next slide, please. And so we were able to find quite a lot of material that we had related to her father's case in the archives. These were some public documents that reflected the campaign that we led to investigate his disappearance. We were also able to produce some copies of some letters, some correspondence from world leaders, including Bill Clinton, to Amnesty and the family, to say that they were aware of the case and they were pursuing diplomatic means. The end of that story was that despite the Libyan authorities' repeated calls to say that they had nothing to do with it, Mr. El-Kikia's body was found after the fall of the Gaddafi regime in 2012 in a military facility. So for almost 20 years, his family didn't have any answers. And next slide, please. This quote is from Mr. El-Kikia's daughter, which I thought was very meaningful in the context. One of the points that we really wanted to get across, and I'll leave it up for you to read it. One of the points we really wanted to make was something that Harry touched on, was about the frustration and pain of absence in the archive, of not being able to find what you're looking for. And I think that this quote kind of speaks to that a little bit, where she says that disappearance, in contrast to death, where you have answers, disappearance is surreal and moving. It can feel like you're betraying justice. There's a powerlessness and a guilt that comes from disappearance that is deeply uncomfortable. And as time passes, I realize how present the unease still is. So that's very much what we would like to speak to, really, is that the very fact of not finding material in the archive can actually, for us, for me personally, be more difficult than finding material that is helping families get answers. And next slide, please. The second case study we wanted to tell you about was about the Ogoni Nine and Esther Kiobel. Esther is very present to us because she has been a very, very prominent activist in not letting this case disappear into history for the last 30 years. And she visited us in November 2025, just November just gone. In contrast to many of our other inquiries, like Jihan's, who I was just talking about, they're all done by email. Esther did actually visit us, which is not a common experience for us. So the Ogoni Nine were activists in Nigeria, in the Ogoni region. The most prominent member was the writer Ken Saro-Wiwa, but it also included Dr. Baron M. Kiobel, who was Esther's husband. They were environmental activists who were opposed to operating the practices of the Royal Dutch Shell Oil Corporation, otherwise known as Shell, in the Niger Delta Ogoni region. Through a relationship between Shell and the Nigerian government at the time, they were targeted and arrested on false charges, and they were all executed in November 1995, and their bodies were not treated well, and it was overall a very horrific case. And next slide, please. Yeah, so this is Esther has been absolutely tireless in her pursuit to get her husband exonerated of the charges that were brought against him, and to bring Shell to some kind of justice on this. And so on the right-hand side of the screen there, you can see a picture of a poster of Esther. A film has been made about Esther and this case. And this is a photo of Malcolm and Esther when she came in to view some of our documents. And this was one of our volunteers here, Carolyn, who was helping. She was a former researcher on Africa. And together they're looking at some of the research documentation that we had on her husband's case. Next slide, please. And in that file, she found a photograph of her husband that she had never seen before. So we were able to provide that to her. And so what we really wanted to say in summary of this was that it very much touching on what Eliza said about having a why. The trauma for us can be harder when we aren't able to provide any truth recovery or accountability. We are helping, we believe we're helping families find dignity in finding out more case, and the preservation of evidence. So all of these things that Eliza mentioned, we also feel. And just lastly on that, next slide, please. We just wanted to refer very briefly to our amazing volunteers who are also have the potential to encounter very, very traumatic material when it's not expected. And that's a big thing that we really wanted to flesh out, that is kind of knowing what to expect helps a lot with minimizing that trauma response. And all our volunteers are former staff members. In total, we have 3 volunteers, and in total, they have about 70 years of experience with Amnesty. So we're learning a lot from them about how they cope with trauma over the years also. And then next slide, please.
Yeah, just lastly, we just wanted to also touch on how Amnesty supports us in our day-to-day work. And we feel that Amnesty's made some great strides to becoming a trauma-informed organisation in recent years. And there are a number of support programmes for Amnesty employees, which are actively promoted internally on our intranet and through webinars. So we have a confidential employee assistance programme, which is available 24 hours a day. Obviously, Amnesty operates several regional offices, so it's important that assistance is available to colleagues, whatever time zone they may be in. We do have specialised trauma counselling available to us, and also crisis counselling if someone's at risk of harming themselves or others. We also have a network of psychological first aiders at Amnesty, and this is a staff network made up of colleagues from different IS offices who've been trained in trauma-focused psychological first aid. Amnesty does also offer medical insurance to employees where if they're operating in a country with no national health service. So, yes, in conclusion, many questions still to consider around how to develop a fully trauma-informed approach to our work, but yeah, we're very heartened by events like this and that others in the profession are engaging. So yes, thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Malcolm and Gillian, for the third, also generous presentations. And it was really interesting to see also the connections between work at these different archives, but also like some shared